Joining us now is Professor Taylor Dark, chair of the Political Science Department at Cal State Los Angeles. Professor, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
First up, Ukraine's president told his people Russian troops will storm the capital city tonight, but also expressed hope today about a potential of negotiations to end the invasion. So two questions here. Do you think that's likely to happen? And two, what might Putin be willing to accept to end this crisis?
I don't think negotiations are going to happen anytime soon. The whole purpose of this military incursion is to, I think, to remove the leadership in Ukraine. And so to have a negotiated settlement at this point is really far short of what I think Putin would like to achieve. So I really don't see that going anywhere. However, if the military conflict goes poorly for Russia, they might change their mind, but right now I don't see that. I think they're going to proceed until they install a puppet government. And so I think even if the current leadership, President Zelensky, was to say, we're willing to back down and not join NATO ever, I don't think that's going to be enough. That would not solve the problem. So I don't see negotiations being successful right now, I'm afraid.
Well, Professor, even though Russian troops are bearing down right now on Kyiv, earlier the U.S. said today the Russian advance has been slowed, and partly because of Ukraine's Air Force. How do the Russian and Ukrainian militaries compare?
Well, I mean, the Russian military is just vastly more powerful, and so far only a portion of their capabilities are being utilized. There's many more troops outside of the country that are adjacent to Ukraine that could be brought in and will be brought in. And so it's hard to imagine that the Ukrainian government the military can last that long, although they seem to be doing a little better than some people thought in this initial period. But, the resources of Russia are just vastly greater than those of Ukraine. And so the Ukrainian military will be defeated. I think that's a certainty. It's really just a matter of time. And then the really interesting question is going to be, what kind of insurgency may there be in Ukraine, kind of guerrilla warfare, clandestine activity, and will that go on indefinitely? In which case, we're going to have a big mess. We're going to have a lot of violence and death and destruction going on for a very long period of time. And that's, it's hard to foresee exactly how that part will play out.
Professor, for weeks we've been talking about economic sanctions. How much of a difference can those sanctions make, since Russia has apparently built up such a reserve of money and gold?
I think the sanctions, if they're going to have any impact, are going to be much more long-term, meaning months into the future, maybe many months or a year or more. The sanctions have been planned for, as you noted, and what I think the hope behind the sanctions really is that they will combine with the war going poorly for the Russians. I mean, poorly meaning ongoing violence and an inability to really control things in Ukraine, in which case there may be pressures from the elites in Russia, military and governmental figures, business elites, as well as the general public getting increasingly dissatisfied. And at that time, there might be pressure on Putin from within Russia to perhaps accept some kind of, pullout or settlement short of, continued occupation. So it's longer term. It's not going to make any difference in the next weeks or months.
Professor, what is the likelihood that Putin will try to advance into other countries?
Well, I think it's very low. He doesn't, he's not intent on starting World War III. He's not going to try to engage with NATO countries, I believe. If he does, I think that would indicate that he's losing his sense of sanity, because that would, that would risk the possibility of, well, it would in fact lead to full-scale military conflict between NATO and the Russian Federation. So I think he's going to avoid that. The danger more is that there'll be accidental escalation, that a U.S. or NATO plane will be shot down because it's flying close to Ukraine, or vice versa, or some other kinds of conflicts will occur. The longer this conflict continues and the worse it gets, and the more that there's a lack of control, and insofar as the Russians face an insurgency, that increases the possibility of these unplanned encounters between NATO and Russia, and those are the kinds of things that scare people.
All right, some very good insight. Thank you so much, Professor, for taking the time to talk to us about the situation in Ukraine and Russia. Hope to have you back sometime soon. Thanks so much.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thank you.